Rocky, a giant German shepherd, had taken to sleeping outside his booth in the snow. After 3 hours, his owner felt pressed to find out why. What he discovered inside was totally shocking. And before we start, if you enjoy this story, please subscribe and like the video for more amazing stories. Matthew was startled when the giant German shepherd growled at him. He'd raised Rocky from a puppy, and the two had always been best friends. He approached the dog's booth again, and the dog reacted in exactly the same way. He stepped between him and the kennel door, lifting his lip on one side, and growled softly, as if to warn Matthew not to come any closer. The snow crunched beneath Matthew's feet as he stepped to one side. The moment he did, Rocky quit growling. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. "What have you got in there?" Rocky wagged his tail and dropped his head. Then he walked over to Matthew to have his ears scratched. He thought the confrontation was over, so he stepped to his right and approached the kennel again. But as he did before, Rocky stepped in front of Matthew and took on a warning posture. Matthew shook his head. He'd never know what happens in a dog's head, best to leave it to sort itself out. Whatever was in the booth was clearly important to Rocky, so let him have his fun. While walking through the snow to the back door, Matthew decided to take a look again the following morning. All of this had started during the summer of the previous year. Matthew, a keen carpenter, had spent the last few weeks of fall building a spectacular kennel for Rocky. It had a porch and ample space inside for the dog to shelter from the snow, which Matthew expected to start falling in early December. And that's exactly how it happened. The temperature dropped, and the first snow fell. Rocky instinctively understood that the structure Matthew had built was for him, and in no time he had turned it into his personal fiefdom. Rocky had rearranged the blankets Matthew had laid out for him and ate his meals on his own porch when Matthew brought out the bowl in the mornings and evenings. In Matthew's opinion, Rocky was the most spoiled dog in the whole of Baltimore, perhaps even the United States. That evening, Matthew peeked through the drapes in his bedroom, and sure enough, Rocky was lying on the porch of his booth. His head rested on his front paws, but his ears were standing upright as if he were on guard. A light snow had been falling for about an hour, and Matthew peeked out one last time before he went to bed. Rocky was still on the porch of his kennel. It was freezing outside, but he hadn't moved. This was really odd. Shortly after sunrise, Matthew walked out to the booth again. The previous night's snow had added at least 2 inches to the white carpet that covered the entire property. Rocky jumped to his feet when he saw Matthew. But when Matthew tried to make his way past the dog to the entrance of the kennel, Rocky stepped in front of him again. Exactly like the day before. The German shepherd looked at his master pleadingly, as if to say, "Please don't try again." As soon as Matthew would make a move toward the entrance of the booth, the lip would lift, and the soft growl would follow. The dog was doing exactly what he had done the day before. He was trying to keep Matthew from looking inside the kennel. Matthew was completely flabbergasted. He had no idea what to make of Rocky's outlandish behavior. But then he hatched a plan. He walked briskly through the snow to the kitchen door. Once inside, he took a slab of raw steak from the fridge and started chopping it into small cubes. This was Rocky's favorite treat. The dog wouldn't be able to resist a bowl of chopped steak. Of that, Matthew was sure. The only challenge would be to convince Rocky to come and eat it in the kitchen. With the bowl in hand, Matthew walked outside and over to the booth again. Like earlier, Rocky jumped up to greet him. Matthew went down on his haunches and made a fuss of the dog. Then he produced the bowl from behind his back and let Rocky smell it. The dog almost jumped out of his skin. Then got him quite as excited as a bowl of freshly chopped steak. But when Matthew walked away, bowl in hand and called for Rocky, the dog sat down. This was unusual. He normally got his treats at his booth. Now his owner wanted him to follow him to the kitchen. Rocky was torn. He looked over his shoulder at the booth and whined softly. Then, seemingly making up his mind that all would be well for the next few minutes while he wolfed down his treat, he bounded after Matthew. In the kitchen, Matthew was on his haunches again. The dog followed him inside and jumped around, his eyes fixed on the bowl of steak. Part 1 of Matthew's plan had come together to perfection. He placed the bowl on the floor in the far corner of the kitchen and made a fuss of the dog again. Rocky tucked in. He didn't try to get all the steak in his mouth at once like most other dogs would do. Instead, he seemed to savor every bite. This had always fascinated Matthew, the way this German Shepherd seemed to relish his food. Now it was time for phase 2 of his plan. Matthew got up slowly. He walked backward towards the door, keeping his eyes on the dog. Rocky paid him no attention. Matthew exited the kitchen and pulled the door shut behind him. Phew! Phase 2 was executed successfully. He started making his way over to the kennel. Inside the kitchen, Rocky had been alerted of the ruse the moment the kitchen door had closed behind Matthew. And he wasn't happy. Not at all. He barked twice and then seemed to understand Matthew had tricked him. Rocky scratched at the back door and whined urgently. When it was clear Matthew was ignoring him, he ran around into the lounge. The lounge had big windows and Rocky could see his booth from there. He saw Matthew walk over and ended up upsetting him even more. He barked louder and jumped up against the window. Matthew heard the commotion inside and looked over his shoulder at the house. There was Rocky, perched up against the lounge window with his front paws and looking at him resentfully. Matthew didn't like the fact that he'd had to lure the dog inside the house and close him up. It felt like he was betraying his best friend. Like it would somehow break the bond of trust that had established since Rocky was a puppy. But he simply had to see what Rocky was protecting inside his booth. And there was no way Rocky would allow him close. Desperate situations call for desperate measures. He decided and pressed on toward the booth. When he reached the kennel, Rocky became frantic. For a few seconds, Matthew was sure Rocky would break the glass and come streaking through the lounge window. And the dog wasn't barking anymore. It was now snarling and growling in a really agitated manner. The dog's anger seemed to grow as Matthew approached the entrance to the booth. Matthew got on his hands and knees and put his head through the opening. He hadn't built windows into the booth when he'd built it, so it was more than a little murky inside. He got a whiff of the typical doggy smell and tried to look around in the dim light. Then he reached out and took hold of the one corner of Rocky's blanket. When he pulled on it, he was greeted with a loud, fierce hiss. Matthew instinctively jumped back, his heart now beating in his throat. His first thought was a snake, but it would have to be a giant one to be able to hiss that loudly and aggressively. Besides, it was winter, and the chances of encountering a snake were almost nil. Carefully, slowly, and holding his forearm in front of him to protect himself in case the thing inside decided to attack, Matthew made another approach. Again, he took hold of the corner of the blanket. Then he slowly pulled it back. The hissing sound again. This time, louder and more aggressively. Hesitantly, Matthew pushed his head through the opening. He was completely vulnerable now, because his head and elbow couldn't fit through the opening at the same time. If something on the inside attacked him, he was completely defenseless. Curiosity got the better of him. Once his eyes shook off the glare and adjusted to the gloom inside, he spotted it. It was a raccoon. For a moment, Matthew was confused. By all standards, a raccoon would have simply fled, yet this one was standing its ground. Just like Rocky had done, it was defending something. Then Matthew saw it. First, he only spotted one kit or baby raccoon. Then he spotted a second in the folds of Rocky's blanket. Then a third and fourth. When he'd finished counting, he'd gotten up to 6. Matthew immediately understood. The mother raccoon had needed a safe spot to give birth when the late snow began to fall. And being the gentleman he was, Rocky had sacrificed his home for her. And then proceeded to offer guard services too, completely free of charge. Matthew couldn't help but smile at the realization. Rocky, the loyal and gentle giant, had made an incredible sacrifice for the mother raccoon and her kids. He had shared his space and had even become their protector, even against his own owner. As the days turned to weeks, Matthew decided to create a cozy shelter for the raccoon family nearby. He made a comfortable nest and ensured that a safe place to stay. Rocky, understanding the situation, took his kennel back but always kept a watchful eye on them. Always ready to stand guard, until they were ready to go explore the world on their own. What do you think about this story? Have you ever seen animals of different species taking care of each other? Tell us your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more.